Hello there, my name's Patrick Denny and welcome to this video presentation about the Colchester Rag Trade and in particular the manufacture of men's ready-made tailoring. Now, the very fact we're talking about the Colchester Rag Trade may come as a bit of a surprise or news to some of you watching this, because you may have thought, well, I didn't even know we had a rag trade in Colchester. And I think, yes, it's probably one of the best kept secrets in Colchester's recent history. But, you know, certainly up until the 1880s, Colchester was the largest centre for the rag trade outside of London. And from that time period, some of the larger northern towns and cities like Leeds and Manchester slowly crept up and overtook Colchester. But, you know, Colchester remained a major force in the industry for decades to follow. And it really is an interesting story and one that needs to be told. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to move on to my first slide and we'll make a start. And I think for most people, when they think about men's ready-made tailoring, you know, where you can go and buy a suit off the peg, they probably think of the Montague Burtons of this world. I'm sure many here tonight can remember a Burton's, in Colchester, for example. Montague Burton started off his tailoring empire in 1903 and became famous for manufacturing suits already made off the peg in all different sizes. He wasn't the only one. This was the 50-shilling tailor, sometimes they're called the 50 bob tailor, where you could go and buy a suit for 50 shillings, founded by Henry Price, also in 1903 in the early 20th century. And later, of course, they became John Collier's. You may remember the adverts, John Collier, the window to watch. But what people probably don't realise is that long before, nearly 100 years before these tailors had made their mark in the early 20th century, they were, they were beaten to this by a firm called Hayams. And Hayams, or Hayam is the firm's name, were operating as, manufacturing ready-made clothing early in the 19th century, way before the Burtons and all the rest of them, the John Colliers of this world. And if you have a look at the address where they started from, St Buttle Street, Colchester. Now, Hayam, although he started off here in Colchester, St Buttle Street, he went on to be the forerunner, or certainly one of the main forerunners of the ready-made tailoring industry in the United Kingdom. And he had shops and premises all over the kingdom, in all the major cities. And it started off here in Colchester. And what we're going to have a look at tonight is some of the evidence as to how we know that. And although he was the first, other clothing factories obviously followed his example. And by the turn of the 20th century, there was at least 10 major clothing factories in Colchester. If you look, if we just look at if you look at the census records, for example, now you could pick any census record. I'm just going to pick about 3, but you could almost pick any page. This is St Buttles Parish, 1871. And in this column here, which gives occupations, if you have a look here, we can see 3 tailoresses. If we almost take these pages at random, this is St Buttles Parish, 1891, and tailoresses. Virtually every page you pick on. Certainly by about 1900, there was at least 5,000 local women, both in the factories and working at home as tailoresses. And it wasn't just those confined to the town, Colchester. For about a 10-mile radius around Colchester, in most of the villages, many of the women there were doing tailoring for the Colchester factories. This is Boxted, 1881. They are all tailoresses. So it just gives you an idea of the size of the industry. And in this slide, you can see all these red stars. Well, the red star in the middle is Colchester. And all these other stars round about are villages within about a 10-mile radius roughly of Colchester, some going over into Suffolk, where multiple tailoresses were working, probably for the Colchester factories. Now, this just explains a bit more what I was saying in the beginning about Colchester being second only to London for many years. This is a chart showing tailoresses. So we're not talking about men, the tailors, These are the women, tailoresses, in London, Colchester, Leeds, and other centres. We've got Norwich, Manchester, Huddersfield, and Halifax. And from 1851 right the way through to 1911. Now, if we look in 1851, London's always been first. But if we look in 1851, there's 8,294 tailoresses. This is based on the census in London. Colchester is second, 750. Leeds, look, only had 29. Manchester, 284. In 1861, London, 12,000 plus. Colchester, 1,189. In 1871, Colchester is still second, ahead of Manchester. And it wasn't until 1881 that Colchester dropped to third place, just behind Leeds. We're still ahead of Manchester. And if we go right to 1911, London 31,718, Colchester 3,598. Now Leeds has gone up, Manchester's gone up, but we're still in fourth place. You know, London first, then Leeds, then Manchester, and then Colchester. And the industry continued right on through the interwar period up until really about the 1960s, maybe the 1970s, when it finally finished. So the question that we could ask, and we'll answer this before we get to the end of the talk, why did the tailoring trade flourish in Colchester of all places? And what evidence can we look at to learn more about the industry? I mean, why not Cambridge? Why not Bury St Edmunds, Norwich, Oxford? Why Colchester? And what kind of evidence can we look at to learn more? Because unfortunately, none of the Colchester tailoring factories, and there were many, none of them have left any records. No business records have survived. So we've had to hunt around for little scraps of evidence and try and build up a picture. And I like to illustrate it like this. We're all familiar with jigsaw puzzles. And we know that if you want to complete a jigsaw puzzle, you have to get all these individual pieces and try and put them together. One or two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle on their own are not going to be much help. But once you start getting half a dozen or more together, it starts to build a little picture. And I like, and when you're doing local history research, or even family history research, if you like, you need evidence. You have to look at the census, newspapers, wills, parish registers, and so on and so forth. And each of these little sources are like individual parts of that jigsaw. And you have to find as many pieces as you can. With a proper jigsaw puzzle, of course, it's a bit easier, because normally you'll have a box with all the pieces inside, and it will tell you on here that there's 1,000 pieces. 1,000 pieces of evidence, if you like. So once you've got all those together, you've solved the problem. And they even make it easier for you, because they put a picture on the front normally, showing you what the end result would look like. But of course, with family history or local history or researching the Hayams or the clothing industry of Colchester, you don't know how many pieces of evidence there are. And you certainly don't know what the final picture looks like. So it's a bit harder, but it's a nice sort of thrilling thing, really. It's like being a detective. So I'm not going to show you everything. We haven't got time to do everything, but we're going to take you through some of the source material that we were able to find out about Hayam and some of the other companies. One of the first things we looked at was this document here. This is a little booklet. They didn't even have one of these in Colchester. We had to go to Chelmsford for this, the record office, and it's an Essex almanac for 1864. And under the Colchester, it covers all the towns in Essex, but under Colchester, it gives you a little bit of a potted history, but it also says something here about the local industries. And if I just blow that bit up, it says here, look, from here, the majority are engaged in the usual occupations of a country town. There being no manufacturers except the silk factory of Mr. Brown, which employs about 250 hands, and the large wholesale tailoring establishments of Messrs. Hayam, no, Hayam is spelt differently there, Messrs. Moses, Mr. Hurst, Mrs. Hammond, and Mr. Stickney. And this is interesting, there being about 2,000 women and 200 men employed in the trade. So that's 1864, way before the Burtons of this world. But And it's probably a rough figure. I mean, I wouldn't say there's exactly 2,000, but you know, it's a sizable number, and greatly outnumbering the men. So that gives us something perhaps to go on. Now, another good source to have a look at, and one that we looked at, is the Victoria County History series. Now, this is the front page of the Victoria County History for Essex, Volume 2. Now, Volume 2 is a useful one to get hold of if you can, because it covers social history, for one thing, and it also covers all the industries. Not only industries at the time, but going right back in medieval times. And the Volume 2, this one we're looking at, was published in 1907, and it was edited by a man called Miller Christie. And Miller Christie was quite thorough. He went and did a lot of interviewing and asked people about their jobs and how they did this, how they did that. And on page 484 of the book, down this left-hand column here, he speaks a bit about the local tailoring industry. And it seems as though he'd gone around the tailoring companies at that time and questioning them and, doing a bit of oral history, if you like. And this is what he said. Look, it's quite interesting. So far as I have been able to ascertain, the oldest business of the kind in Colchester is that now known as M. Hayam Wholesale Clothing Company Limited of the Abbey Works. With this firm, apparently, the industry originated locally. The founder, one Hayam, carried on a pawnbroking business in Colchester in the early years of the 19th century. According to a tradition preserved by the firm, he had left on his hands, in some way, on one occasion, a large quantity of woolen cloth, perhaps bay, made by some firm in the wool weaving trade, then just expiring locally. To get rid of this, he decided to have it made up into garments. The experiment proving successful, he decided to continue it as a business. And this appears to have been about the year 1825, because in 1826 he's listed in a local directory along with 9 others as a closed dealer. And so that's a starting point. According to Miller Christie, Hayam was started operating somewhere around the early 1820s. So anyway, one of the things we decided to do was have a look in the local press. Now, the Standard, which would be the normal place to go to, didn't start publishing until 1831. So we had to look at the Ipswich Journal. And I had to go over to at this time of day, to the Suffolk Record Office, although, of course, it's now online, makes it so much easier. But starting searching from around the 1870s, going through decades and decades almost, finally, on May the 3rd, 1800, I finally found a reference to the Hayam family. And it's on this page, but it was down the bottom here, on the left-hand side, right at the bottom, this little article here. This is what it said. S. Hayam, now that's Simon Hayam, and son. The son is Hayam, our Hayam. So S. Hayam and son are advertising cheap, new and second-hand clothes warehouse, pawnbrokers and salesmen, at the sign of the 3 Bulls, Car Street, Ipswich. And they will just read the first few lines. Respectfully inform the public in general that they have now received from London a very large and select assortment of men's, boys and women's new and second-hand clothes, which they are determined to sell as cheaply as in London. And then he goes on to talk about silver, jewellery, hardware and all sorts of things. So that was the earliest really starting point we can find about Hayam. And that's 1800. We have to go another 3 years or so before his name pops up again. And this is October 1803, when there's a falling out or something happens between father and son. And it says here, partnership dissolved. Whereas the partnership between Simon Hayam and Hayam, although he's called Hayam, his name was really Henry, but he was always known as Hayam, is this day mutually dissolved, and their respective business will in future be carried on their separate accounts. Now, in this particular paper, right next to this advert was this one, a larger one by Hayam himself. So he's now starting up on his own, new and second-hand clothes warehouse, wholesale and retail, watchmaker, jeweller, the rest of it, Great White Horse Inn, or opposite the Great White Horse Inn, Tavern Street, Ipswich. And the advert is very similar. and you know, just returned from London with assortment of clothes and so on and so forth. So by 1803, Hayam is now on his own, but he's still in Ipswich. Nothing to do with Colchester yet, and no indication that he's manufacturing clothes or making ready-made clothes yet. He's just selling them. Keep going through the Ipswich Journal, and finally, on July the 15th, 1815, his name pops up again. And this time, at Harwich. Hayam, broker and clothier. I think that's the first time he's used the word clothier at the King's Head, Harwich, and he's offering his business. Now, we learn later on that he's about this time he gives up his Ipswich tenancy, so he's now firmly in Harwich, but still nothing about Colchester. So perhaps Miller Christie was right. Maybe it was going to be sometime in the 1820s. Well, then we look at these directories that Miller Christie in the Victoria County History spoke of. Now, this is Piggott's directory for Essex, 1823. And under pawnbrokers, we have, right at the top here, Hayam, pawnbroker and salesman, Buttle Street. So no indication still about him dealing or making clothes. But then if we look at the next edition that's available, 2627, although Hayam appears under the column of pawnbrokers still, he also appears now under this heading clothes dealers that Miller Christie spoke about. And here we can see, along with 9 others, there's 10 altogether, there is Hayam. Also, look, Levi Mordecai. Many of these early clothes dealers were Jews, and there is a massive, great sort of federation of them, really, that all work together. But although these clothes dealers didn't appear in the 1823 edition, we can't assume they all started their business in the last like 36 months. It's just, they're probably well-established businesses, but they've just decided to group themselves under their own heading as clothes dealers, because probably a lot of their trade is coming from this now. Okay, so let's move on to the next one, and this next one is really important. This is a handbill. This is like an advertising handbill. Now, the original size of this, I would say, is a little bit larger than A5. And it's on very, very thin paper. If you imagine a Bible, you know how thin the papers are normally? It's something like that. You hold it up to the light, you can kind of see through it. And this is about 1828. And we've got Hayam, pawnbroker and clothier, wholesale and retail, St Buttle Street, Colchester. At the top here, look, a saving of 20% in the article of clothing. Notice he always says this, for ready money only. And what he says here, look, he has now on sale a choice stock of, this is really important, homemade men's and boys' new ready-made clothes. Now, when we think of that, you might think, well, so what? There's nothing strange in that. In 1828, that was right at the forefront. That was almost unknown anywhere. All clothes were made by tailors individually, bespoke. And what Hayam is doing, he's having them all ready-made, selling them already made off the peg in different sizes. And down the bottom here, he's got a whole list of the sort of things you can buy. You can go and buy some Bevertine trousers for 4 shillings, already made. You can go in the shop, walk out with them. Other interesting things here, it says here again, at very lowest prices for ready money only. The lowest price are fixed, no abatement made, so you can't go and get a discount. Interesting, he says here, look, no business done at this shop after 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon until Saturday night. That was the Jewish Sabbath. In other words, his shop was shut on Saturday. You might think, my goodness, that's the best day for trading. But he wouldn't open his shop until dusk on Saturday evening. And if that happened to be in the summer, say in June or July, dusk might not be till between 8 and 9 o'clock. So he would open his shop then and keep trading till about 11 or 11:30 p.m. And it must have worked because people would wait and go in town in the evening because they knew they could get cheap clothes from Hayams. Now, something else I'd just like to tell you about this. I don't know if you've noticed it, but can you see something's been written on the back of this and it's bled through onto this side. Can you see that there? Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to flip this over. Now, well, first of all, let me tell you where this comes from. This, I saw this document in the Essex Record Office in the Colchester branch at the time, and I was looking at a whole bundle of miscellaneous accounts, overseers accounts for the parish of St Butolph. There was all sorts of things, letters, accounts, statements, all sorts of things. A big thick bundle. I'm going through them one at a time, and all of a sudden I came through this little, very thin handbill, what you're looking at now. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. If we flip it over, you can, and turn it upside down, we can see what's written on here. Now, to make it even easier for you, I've taken that off and I'm going to put it on its own. It says here, Mr. Saward bought of H. Hayam, pair Bevertine trousers, 4 and 6pence, received B. Hayam. That is Benjamin Hayam, his son, who was obviously working in the shop with his father. Now, Hayams probably never bothered to give receipts, but this was purchased by one of the overseers or somebody from the workhouse, probably at St Butolph's parish. Maybe he wanted to buy a pair of trousers for one of the, the poor inmates or something like this. And he'd gone into Hayams. You can imagine him picking up his trousers, almost walking out the shop door and stopping dead in his tracks and thinking, hang on a minute, I need a receipt. I've got to claim my money back from the parish. So he goes to the counter and he says, can I have a receipt, please? You can almost see Benjamin fumbling around because he hasn't actually got a receipt book. And then he looks down on the counter and he sees a pile of these handbills. And he picks one up, flips it over and scribbles a little note on the back. And the very fact he did that is the reason we're looking at this document today, because it went back into the official records of St Butolph's parish, the accounts, which eventually have ended up in the Essex Record Office. So it's nice to know exactly how a document, if you like, came into being. Okay, let's move on. Now, the next document we can look at, there are lots of newspapers you can see we're looking at. This is now the Essex County Standard. The Essex County Standard opened in 1831, and we're looking at 21st September 1838, and it's down here. Hayam puts a little advert, so he's gone 10 years without putting an advert, and then he puts this advert in the local paper. Constant employment for tailors during the winter at H. Hayams, wholesale clothes manufacturer. And he hasn't said that before. Wholesale clothes manufacturer. He's definitely manufacturing ready-made clothes. Woolen and Manchester warehouseman next to the theatre. He always puts this in his adverts because there were 2 or 3 other like drapery shops, if you like, down St Butolph Street. He didn't want to go to the wrong one. Next to the theatre. St Butolph Street, Colchester. Masters in town and country in want of work to keep on their apprentices and men may obtain the same by applying at the above establishment. What Hayam is doing here, in order to get all these clothes made up, he's obviously employing local tailors, journeyman tailors. And he's probably giving, asking one tailor to make up 20 or 30 jackets, another to make up 20, 30 trousers, and so on and so forth. And these tailors are making them up, and then Hayam is selling them. But something interesting happens now. This is 1838. I had a look at the 1841 census and did a very exact count of how many tailoresses and tailors there were in all the Colchester parishes. And it came out in 1841, of all the tailoring, all the people involved in tailoring, men and women, 66% were tailors and 34% were tailoresses. So the men outnumbered the women, sort of 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. Now, what I also noticed when looking through the census records was that whenever you went down a street in Colchester, say Maidenborough Street or somewhere, and you came across someone who was a tailor, almost always within 2 or 3 houses, or even in the same house, you'd find a tailoress, 2 or 3 tailoresses. And then you might go several streets with it, and then you'll see another tailor, and you'll always usually find tailoresses nearby. And I strongly suspect what is happening here, that these tailorers were taking the work of Hayam, And they were then subbing out some of the finishing off work, you know, doing the finishing work, stitching the buttons on or this sort of thing, to their female relatives and neighbours and friends. So they were obviously paying them a pittance, I suppose, but they could take a bit more work from Hayam and earn more money themselves. Because if we jump forward 10 years to the 1851 census, look what's happened. In 1851, 75% of all the tailoring workforce are now women, and tailors only 25%. Something major has happened, because in every succeeding census from here on, women greatly outnumber the men, and the men their share becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, what I think has happened here, Hayam has been giving all these tailors this work, and the men has probably been subbing some of the work out, the easier stuff, to their women neighbours and family maybe. And Hayam is a shrewd guy. He knows they're doing this. So what he decided to do, he probably decided to sideline the professional tailors altogether and employ the women directly himself. Now, to do this, of course, the women wouldn't have known how to make up a whole suit, a whole jacket, a whole pair of trousers. But that didn't stop Hayam. What he did, he subdivided the whole process into lots and lots of different operations. Now, I'm not showing you all of them here. But for example, the one job might be just sewing up trousers. It would all be cut out for you by tailors, and all they've got to do is sew it up. Someone else might sew the jackets together. Someone might fit the linings. All they might do, he might train them to fit pockets. That's all they do. Or fit lapels, make buttonholes. Now, you see, it would be fairly easy to train a woman tailoress just to do any one of these things. And she would become quite good at it, and she'd be very quick at it, but she wouldn't necessarily know how to do all the other jobs. So that was a kind of safeguard, I suppose, for Hayam. But anyway, it must have proved successful, because we know that by the, early to mid 1840s, the tailors in this country were up in arms, because they were being put out of business by people like Hayam and another company called Moses and 2 or 3 others who had cottoned on to this. And I'm going to show you a couple of extracts from national newspapers. Now, this is the Northern Star, so it's mainly, for the northern towns and cities, but 22nd of February, 1844, they're actually talking about Colchester here. It says, the Colchester Tailors Protection Society held a meeting on Thursday evening at the Greyhound Inn in St. Buttle Street, the subject being the hordes of white slaves, these are the women working for Hayam, who eke out a miserable existence at slop work, that's really cheap stuff, so they reckon, for the respectable Messrs. Hayam and Co. If Colchester is not their principal provincial depot, it is among the principal here. He musters from 1,000 to 1,500 hands on his book, who at the nearest calculation are supposed to take out work for as many more, 2/3 of whom are women. Thousands of our members in London and the provinces are worried by the rising competition, and many were becoming bankrupt or forced to become journeymen themselves. And also in Lloyd's Weekly, 12th of November 43, talking about waistcoats, it's a long article, you can read this yourself. Those very waistcoats that Moses and Son, Hayams and other flash tailors who advertise them as superior goods for 7 and 6 each, or 3 for 21 shillings, only cost these money-craving individuals about 4 and 6, or perhaps a little less. I also draw your attention to their light summer waistcoats, which in every respect are pleasing to the eye and got up equal to a bespoke garment. But these are the very garments that are made in the wretched dungeons and by those wretched beings who receive only 9d for each garment. These are then sold on to the wearer for 2 and 6 each. Is this not robbing a fellow Christian? I say it's base robbery and nothing else. Now, so this was what was happening. And we kind of saw it happening in the census between 1841 and 1843. And it may have been that the tailors, by dishing out some of the work to their neighbours and friends, they may have got caught out on that. Hayam probably copied them and did it on a larger scale. And that was how the Colchester trade and most of the tailoring companies around this country will run on that principle from then on. Another very, very important document, Essex County Standard, 20th of January, 1843. This is Hayam announcing his retirement. So H. Hayam, wholesale clothier, tailor and draper, again, look, next to the theatre, St. Bottle Street, Colchester, begs leave to return his grateful thanks to his numerous friends and the public for their kind and liberal support during a residence of 25 years. Now, Miller Christie probably never saw this, because this tells us that he'd been here 25 years, and this was 1842. So you can do the maths. That means he must have arrived here in 1817, a few years earlier than is suggested in the Victoria County history. So we know that he was in Harwich in 1815, but he was only there probably a short while. And by 1817, he's now in Colchester, and 25 years later, he's giving up the business. He's actually living in London at this time, and he's retired. He's a very wealthy man, very, very wealthy man indeed. And he's giving this part of the business over in favour of two of his sons, M and S. Hayam. That's Moses and Simon, two of his sons who take over the Colchester business. And almost straight away, they start improving the shop, the business. And here we've got on the 16th of May, 1845, Summer Fashions, M&S Hayams, tailoring and outfitting establishment, St. Butler Street, Colchester. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, they really go for it on their adverts. Look, largest stock in the world. It's not the largest stock in Essex or England. This is the largest stock in the world. And they show some of their stock they've got here. And if we look on the next one, another one, this is April the 18th, 1845. I mean, most of their adverts are on the front page, right at the top. You can't miss them. So here we've got another one, the new and extensive premises in St. Butler Street, Colchester, adjoining the theatre, now complete, M&S Hayam. And they're offering all sorts of stuff here, French and beaver hats, fancy caps. It says here, look, at this establishment, every garment is marked in plain figures at the very lowest selling price. No abatement whatsoever will be made, the same old story. And here notice on Tuesday and Wednesday next, April the 22nd and 23rd, and on the following Monday and Tuesday, April the 28th and 29th, no business will be transacted at this establishment. That was like their Easter Passover, if you like. But what I want to show you, and this is really important, this was really astounding, this bit down the bottom here. And if I show you that enlarged, it gives you, it says here that M&S Hayam, their wholesale establishments and manufactories are in King Street, London, and Colchester, Queen Street. But they have retail establishments already up and running in 1845 at Colchester, London, Manchester. Now these are city centre addresses, Liverpool, Glasgow, Bristol, Birmingham, and Leeds. So Hayam is not just a small provincial operation in Colchester. He has now expanded across the country, and more was to come. It really was. So he's really, you know, when I say he's at the forefront, he might have been right at the very forefront of mass-produced clothing in this country, started off here in St. Bottle Street in Colchester. And of course, in the 1860s and 1867, he was the first one of the tailoring firms to build their own purpose-built factory. And it's still here. It's the only clothing factory left in the centre of Colchester. And you know where it is. It's on just off Southway. It's offices or something now. But that was Hayam's factory, and still probably in operation, probably up to about the 1970s, I would suggest. Let's have a quick look at the family. We've been talking about Hayam, and we mentioned some of his sons. Well, look, first of all, Simon Hayam, the father, born 1740, and we think he was born in Hamburg. There's a question mark there, but he certainly he arrived from Hamburg, him and his wife, and they settled in Ipswich in the 1770s. Now, we know he married Rose. We don't know what her surname was, so she was also from Hamburg, and they came to Ipswich, and in 1875, Hayam was born. He was born in Ipswich. And when he got a bit older, of course, he went into partnership with his father. Now, like many of these Jewish people, tradesmen, they may have started off as a simple peddler, going around selling stuff door to door. And some of the ones who did well opened up their own warehouses and so on, which is probably what Simon and Hayam did. Anyway, Hayam married Hannah Lazarus. This is another Jewish firm born in Rochford. And they had all these children, look. So they had Rachel, she was the eldest. Then we've got Lawrence. I've just mentioned the boys. We've got Lawrence, David, Benjamin, Samuel, Moses, and Simon. And underneath their names, I'm indicating where they opened up businesses alongside their father. We've already spoken about Moses and Simon. We know they opened up in Colchester and they had premises in London. But let's go back to the beginning. Lawrence, he opened up business in Bury St Edmunds and London. David, Bristol, Exeter, Hull and London. Benjamin, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow and Dublin. Samuel, Birmingham, Leeds and London. Between them, they've virtually covered all the major outlets, virtually everywhere that you could think of. And here we've got David being mentioned. Now, if I just remind you, so you don't forget, David, look, went to Bristol to start with. So here we see in 1834, Mr. H. Hayam of this town to Miss H. Moses, Mr. David Hayam, son of Mr. Hayam of this town, to Miss Moses, second daughter of E. Moses, another big tailoring firm, Esquire of Bristol. So David goes down there and opens up a big business. And again, it's easy now because you can look on newspapers online and you can read all these accounts. But this is an advert in 1838 from David Hayam at 42 Wine Street, Bristol. Notice he says he's also got shops and places at Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Birmingham, Colchester and Bury St Edmunds. That's David, if we are to believe what this says. And then he goes on to say that, listing all of his stuff, and down the bottom here, not open on Saturdays and so on and so forth. Much the same as his father. And if we just look at the slightly larger version of that, there you can see it. So, he's soliciting the attention of the nobility, the gentry, the inhabitants of Bristol, and very, very expensive adverts. Now, Andrew Phillips and I, in the early 1990s, we were sort of doing this together, really, I suppose. And we found out that in the Bodleian Library, they had a lot of old trade bills and handbills, and we knew there were lots from the Hayam family. Nowhere else, haven't got them in the Essex Record Office or anywhere else. So we decided to go to the Bodleian Library. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever been there before, but it's a bit difficult to get in. If you're a graduate of Oxford, then no problem. You'll just walk in and out as you like. But because we weren't, we drove all the way down there, and we found the library, went in, and when we got in, there was a massive, quite a large queue in front of us, and they were all one by one going up to the reception desk and asking what they wanted and what they want to look at. Now, we had already phoned them up and we'd already ordered what we want to look at, but we had to go up to this counter. And then it was my turn, and Andrew was coming up behind me. And when you got to the desk, the person asked who you were and what you were doing. And then she handed you a card and she says, I want you to read aloud. This is in front of everybody else. I want you to read aloud these words. And this is what she handed me. So you have to read this out. I hereby undertake, you can't do it silently, you've got to read aloud, not to remove from the library or to mark, deface or injure in any way any volume, document or other object belonging to it or in its custody, not to bring into the library or kindle therein any foul flame, not to smoke in the library, and I promise to obey all the rules of the library. And of course we said, yes, we will. So we went into this, their version of the record office, not a very large room, but we went in there and we got to see all these documents. And one of them, the first one we saw was this one by Samuelheim. He's one of the sons who went, this is Birmingham here. And before I turn this around and show you, it's a nice little illustration he's put here. So these are sort of late 1830s-ish, but you can see how the fashionable men at the time were being dressed. We've got a colour version here, look. Now, although the clothes that Hayam produced, they were called slop dealers, although they weren't going to be of the top quality, but they would look the business. And that's why people want to buy them, because they can get them cheaper. But this, this is the sort of fashion that gentlemen were wearing in the 30s, maybe, and the 1840s. But if we look here, this is Samuelheim, merchant tailor, wholesale woolen draper, clothier, hattier, hosier, etc. And he's at this building here, this very unusual name, Technica. That's what this building was known as. It was at 23 New Street, Birmingham. And he goes on, normal advert. He says here, he is the most extensive, the cheapest and most fashionable clothier in the world. That's Hayam. Now, we know that Hayam first opened his business in Birmingham over the road from this big store in 1835, before moving into this building, 23 New Street, around 1837. And also on his advert, he also is proprietor of 11 of the largest clothing establishments in the kingdom. And he mentions them here. Now, you'll notice Colchester is dropped off from now on, but Birmingham, London, 2 in London, Manchester, Liverpool, Dublin, so on and so forth. Now, you need to compare those addresses, because here they are, look. You can see the addresses: London, 86 Oxford Street. We've got Manchester, 26 Market Street. If we look at Lawrence Hayam, this is another son. This is the one who went to Bury St Edmunds in London, at Gracechurch Street, and he lists all his other businesses. And if we compare them with his brother Samuel, they're the same. 23 New Street, Birmingham, 23 New Street. We've got 63 King Street, Manchester. There we are. So what's actually happening? Wherever these Hayam boys are going, they are giving the impression through their advertisements that they are the owners of a massive empire stretching across the country. And they give all the addresses, where in fact these are just the addresses of their brothers' premises. And their brothers are doing the same thing. They're advertising that they own 11 or 12 other shops around the kingdom. Now, it's interesting why they did this. Obviously, they're all clubbing together. In the days before, if you wanted to have a joint stock company, in the early days, you had to have like an act of parliament. And this is probably one of the ways in which they could develop a large family federation of businesses, if you like, while each brother having autonomy. But if any one of them was to go bankrupt, it wouldn't bring the whole lot down. It was quite a good way of doing it, really. But by clubbing together like that, of course, they can buy cloth in massive quantities at the best prices. But it's an interesting little ploy that they're actually making here, and they all did it wherever they went. So here we've got Leeds. This is in Leeds. Look, this is Samuelheim again. And there he's listing all his other establishments. I'm going to whiz through some of these because I'm sure you know the story now. Yeah, this is Lawrence Hayam again. Prices the lowest in the kingdom, and he's in London and actually in Bury St Edmunds. Bernard Hayam, he's in Manchester as part of his advert. And here we've got Bernard Hayam's other establishments, and there they all are listed. Down the bottom here, similar thing, makes no abatement, closed every Saturday until dusk. And then it says here, Hayam's shop is always closed on Saturdays until dusk, when it is open till 12 o'clock. Now, I think in Colchester they open till 11, but some of them here, so even if it's it doesn't open till 7 or 8 o'clock at night, they stay open till midnight. And that's all the Hayams did, that, the same very thing. Note the name, the street, and the number. Liverpool, the same thing. Bernard Hayam was here at Liverpool again. Benjamin Hayam. Great clothing establishment. There's all the sites listed again. Now, while we're talking about Liverpool, Liverpool had a very famous store called Lewis's. Some of you may know of this. And for many, many years, it was that they sold all tailoring and all sorts of things, clothing. And it's only in recent years have they stopped trading. But it was owned by a chap called David Lewis. And it was so popular, they even had like a friends group, the the friends of Lewis's, basically. But doing a bit of a digging around earlier on, I found a little bio, if you like, about David Lewis, who developed the store. He 1823 to 1885. And it says here that David Lewis was born David Levi in London, the son of Wolf Levi, a Jewish merchant. David had at least one brother who emigrated to Australia in the 1840s, and in 1839 he moved to Liverpool to work for Benjamin Hayam & Co. And they describe Benjamin Hayam & Co. as a firm of tailors and outfitters. I think that is seriously understating what they were. But anyway, they're described as a firm of tailors and outfitters. So even one of the most famous names in Liverpool learned his trade from Benjamin Hayam, who was one of Hayam's sons. And that's the man who signed that little receipt that he turned it over and he signed it. Do you remember that? B. Hayam. So look, we've had a look at some sources. We've looked at directories, or, we've looked at handbill accounts. We've mainly looked at newspapers. There's lots more we could do, but of course we haven't got time to do everything here. But I think even at this stage, we haven't finished yet, but even at this stage, we can answer the question, why Colchester? Why did the tailoring industry flourish in Colchester of all places? Now, I know it's a very simple answer I'm going to give you, but I don't think I'm far wrong. It's because Hayam decided to come here. If Hayam had decided to go to Cambridge and open up his shop, I don't think Colchester would have been involved. I may be wrong, but one of the main reasons that the tailoring industry took off in Colchester is because Hayam decided to come here. And once he had made it successful, other tailoring companies in the 1880s, 90s and early 1900s decided to move their factories into Colchester as well. And of course, there was a large workforce, an available workforce. The army was here. Lots of army wives needed work. Agricultural labourers weren't earning much. Their wives needed work. Fishermen in the fishing villages, their wives needed work. And although they were paid a pittance, really, they didn't mind because they wanted the money. It helped the family income. They were prepared to do it. And that's what happened. But anyway, what other source of information could we find? Well, in the early 1990s, about 1991, when we started doing this research, Andrew Phillips put an article in the Standard, because we realised that although there's no official documents that have survived, we've looked at the census and all the other bits and pieces, but there were still many, many women and men, some men out there in Colchester who worked in the clothing factories. Many of these people were getting on in years. Some of them were in the 70s, 80s, 90s years old, but they could tell a story. So Andrew puts this in, look, low pay, long hours, needles through your finger. Andrew Phillips asked, where are the women who worked in Colchester's forgotten rag trade? So the article went out and we had lots of people writing letters. Now, to start with, we had 40 or 50 people write in. Since then, of course, we've added to that, and we're still adding to people who remember it. But anyway, so we had these letters come in. We found out that people work for lots of different factories. Now, these are the principal tailoring factories in Colchester, early 20th century. Some had come and gone, some were still to come, but this is basically it. So Hayams, Hollington's, big London firm, they moved to Colchester. Hart and Levy, Crowthers, Leanings, Peaks, Everett's, Gernardt's, Richmond and Lewis, and the Colchester Manufacturing Company. The Colchester Manufacturing Company, in fact, was still there till about 1970s. It was on the site where the Essex Record Office used to be, and where the registry office is. That was on that, so I can well remember that being there. And it was known locally as Turner's, because one of the directors was, that was his name. But anyway, this is one of the letters that came in. So what happened, all these 40 odd letters came in. So we set up a little team, maybe half a dozen or so of us. And we worked out what we were going to ask. We had to design a sort of a questionnaire. What questions do we want to ask, and so on and so forth. And We thought we knew all the questions, but of course we soon had to change as we went along. I mean, I remember one occasion somebody was interviewing somebody and they got their little list of questions they want to ask. And this lady said, and of course we also got, what does she call it? Dead horse. We got dead horse. And the person doing the interview, hang on a minute, I haven't got that on my list, dead horse. And she said, dead horse money. And apparently dead horse money was that these women, they mainly worked on piecework, so they got paid for the work they did. So if they didn't have a good week, so say they were earning 30 bob a week, £2 a week, and they were paid every week cash, if they'd been ill or they'd had to unpick a lot of their work because it wasn't good enough, or for whatever reason, they've only earned 15 shillings, they could take an advance on next week's money. So they could say, can I have 10 shillings carried forward, backwards, if you like, for this week, for next week? That is called dead horse money, apparently. And of course, when next week comes, they've got to work twice as hard because the first 10 shillings worth of work, they're not going to get paid because they've already had that money. But that's just an example. Once we knew that, of course, then we can ask that question, we can add that to our list of questions. But anyway, this is what Mrs. Daldry wrote. You've probably been reading this. My life at Hollington's factory. It was 4 or 5 pages long. This is the first page. Hollington's was a 6-storey factory building at the bottom end of Stanwell Street, almost opposite St Giles Church, which is the Masonic Hall now. I was 15 years old when I started to work there about 1922. The hours were from 10 to 8 in the morning with an hour and a quarter for dinner and then on until 5 o'clock. I lived at Harwich Road and went home to dinner, which took 25 minutes walk each way. So it left me 25 minutes for my dinner. And she actually, I've just included, I'm going to share with you a few memories now. We're getting towards the end, but I thought this might be interesting. So this is also what Emily told me. She was born in 1908. There wasn't a lot of jobs for the likes of us in those days. You had to go into a factory or get a job in a shop behind a counter. I got a job at Hollington's clothing factory through friends. I was interviewed by Mr. Walkton, the boss, who was ever so strict. I got the job because my cousins already worked there and they were scrappers. I suppose he thought I'd be the same. To start with, you were taught by an experienced person. You had to learn how to do the seams and you had to behave yourself. After about a month, you were put on your own time. I was put in the trouser room and you did everything except the pressing and the finishing off. You earned what you did. It was so much a dozen trousers, but you never earned more than about £2. And for that, you had to work hard. This is another lady I interviewed. This is Ethel Matthews. She was born in 1900. And she says she went to the Blue Coat School, which was in St Helens Lane. She said, I left the Blue Coat School at 14 and got a job at Crowther's clothing factory in the High Street. My first job was on the barring off machine, which was used for making buttonholes on coats. I earned 3 and 2pence a week, 17 pence for 48 hours work. All of us girls worked in 2 big rooms upstairs and below us was the cutting out room. Now, the cutting was only done by the men. We made suits, the whole thing, trousers, jackets and waistcoats, or as we used to call them, vests. You didn't work on everything. You were either a trouser hand, a vest hand, or a coat hand. You did the same thing all the time. It was beautiful working there. I enjoyed every minute of it. We had a good boss, a wonderful boss, one of the best. We used to sing to our heart's content, and he never ever grumbled. As long as you'd done your work, that was all that mattered. Some of these women have told us that what they used to do, they would bring the words of the latest song or whatever the song was at the time, and they would prop them up on their machines or on their desk, and they would all sing the popular songs of the day. This lady I interviewed in 1993. This is Emmy Wendt, and I was giving a talk on Edwardian Colchester, actually, at a it might have been I'm not sure what it was. It might have been a women's institute, somewhere in Strub End anyway. And I happened to put this picture on the screen. And all of a sudden, this lady here put her hand up and she says, I'm on that picture, Mr. Denny. I said, aye. She said, yes. And she says, all of those other girls have all gone. I'm the only one left alive. Now, of course, she was just born in the late Victorian period. And that's her here. And this was the Roe Hedge branch of the Colchester Manufacturing Company, which was in a little lane called Dark House Lane at Roe Hedge. And she told me she would have been about 12 years old, she remembers, about this time. She said that during the First World War, we were mainly kept busy making soldiers' uniforms, as of course were most of the factories. And she went on to almost reach 100. She missed it by about 6 weeks, Emmy. And this is what she had to say in addition. I went straight into the factory when I left school at 14. Nearly everybody went there. The Colchester Manufacturing Company in Dark House Lane. I started on 3 shillings a week, 15p, and didn't have any special training apart from needlework I'd learned at school. We made coats, alpaca coats and officers' tunics. Everyone had separate parts to do. And I was a pocket hand. So that's all she would have done. They were all cut out and I had to sew them onto the jackets. There was a forewoman in charge who checked all the work. And if she found anything wrong, she'd give us the work back and you had to unpick it. You clocked in and you clocked out, and they were very strict regarding timekeeping, but we were allowed to talk and sing. This is Ethel Dyer. Again, you never associated with the trouser hands. The coat hands stuck together. The finishers stuck together. The press house kept to themselves. Each group kept to themselves. If you started as a trouser hand, you remained one. There was not much chance of promotion unless you were on the staff. They were the ones in charge of giving out the work and passing it. The work was given out by the forewoman. When a coat is made, it had to go on to another section and so on until it was finished before finally going to the forewoman who had to pass it. Some of the coats had to be finished by hand, so they were passed on to the finishing table before going down to the press house. If they didn't pass, they came back to the machinist, because you all had a number which was on the ticket, so it could be traced. It would then have to be unpicked and done again. And of course, this would have been in your own time because you're all on piecework. This is the co-op. Now, although it wasn't a factory as such, they had a fairly large tailoring department. Some of you may remember the co-op men's wear department on the corner of Wire Street and Culver Street. This group is standing on the roof of the shop, and you can see in the background what was St Nicholas Church with the big spire that used to stand right next to the High Street. And this girl here is Lillian Oakley, who became Lillian Crick. And she started off working for a firm called Everett's, somewhere near the Hippodrome, before coming and working at the co-op. And there she is, born in 1908, and she became Lillian Crick. And that was Lillian when I interviewed her in 1992. And this is what she had to tell me. I started off at 6 and 6 a week at Everett's. That's where I was taught, and it was the standard wage for the first year. The next year went up to 12 shillings. And by the time I got to my 5th year, it had gone up to 23 shillings. After that, I left and went to the co-op, where I specialised in making waistcoats. We were on piecework, and I would get about 5 shillings for each one made. I could make one waistcoat a day and start another one for the next day. So my wages weren't all that good, perhaps 30 shillings a week. We used to use big 14-pound irons to press our work. They were heated on a gas stove with a flame running through, and you just slid your iron in to be heated up. We used to use a piece of rag to pick up the hot iron. But if they got overheated, we would dip them into a pail of water until we got them down to the heat we wanted. We used to test whether the iron was hot enough by touching it with a wet finger. Not to be recommended. Now, as I said, indicated at the beginning, although many worked in the factories, an even greater number worked in the community. They worked at home. They were out workers. Many of the girls left school at 14. I say every other girl probably went into the clothing factory, say circa 1900. It was second only to domestic service still, but a massive opportunities for girls in the factories. So they started when they were about 14, and they retired, if you like, in inverted commas, when they were about 24. That's when they got married, many of them. And in those days, it wasn't seemly, if you like, for a wife to be seen to be going out to work once she'd got married. But the husband didn't mind them kind of working at home. So what many of these girls did when they got married, they then started doing outwork from home, and work would be delivered, or they would go and get it from the factory, and they would get a different bundle every week, and they would either buy their own machine or borrow one from the factory or what have you. But many of the villagers also had tailoresses, as did Roe Hedge. And I interviewed this man. This is Jack Austin, born in 1907. And when he left school, he got a job with the local carrier, Mr. Fale. Now, I haven't got a picture of Mr. Fale's wagon, but it was something like this, although only he tells me it only had one horse. So this is a carrier cart. And one of his jobs on a Friday in the morning was going around to all these women tailoresses who lived in Roe Hedge, about 15 of them, he said, and collect all the tailoring work they'd done the previous week. And I had to then take it up to Colchester. When we got to Colchester, I had to stable the horse, then take all this tailoring to the various factories, and later on go and collect all their money and their next lot of work for the following week. And Friday evening, I had to go around delivering all this tailoring and pay them their money. He was quite busy on Friday. Let's see what he had to say. When I left school, I went to work for Mr. Fale, who was the local carrier. We used to deliver parcels to and from town and to the clothing factories. Lots of people did tailoring then. On Friday mornings, I used to have to go around to all the women in the village who did outwork for the Colchester factories and pick up their finished work from the previous week. When we got to town, we would stop at the plough yard and put the horse in the stable. I would then have to take the bundles of finished tailoring to the various factories. Later in the afternoon, I would return to the factories to collect the women's wages and new bundles of work for them. When I got home, I would then have to go round their homes again to pay them their money and deliver their new bundles of work. Fridays was always a busy day, and it would be quite late by the time I finished. Hayams was one of the only factories that had their own little motor cart or a little motor van, which they used to probably take that round, but many of them would use the carriers. Or if they lived in Colchester, children have said we used to take mum's tailoring, you know, had to walk through the barracks and go up to the factories pushing it in a pram or in a barrow or something like that. But one of the ladies who worked in Roe Hedge, who I got to speak to, who knew Jack Austin, was Agnes Cork. Now this is Agnes with her husband Albert, who I interviewed both of these, but Agnes in particular we're talking about now, and she was born in 1906. I interviewed her, as you can see, in 1993. And although she started work at age 14 for one of the factories in Roe Hedge, she soon decided she would rather work at home. This is what she had to say. When I left the Roe Hedge factory, I went to the Colchester branch to see if they'd let me have some outwork. I had to see a Mr. Oren, and I remember him looking at me and saying, "I don't think you've left school yet," because I was very small. He said, "Do you think you could do it?" I told him I'm sure I could. Well, they gave me 6 coats to get on with, and by the next day I'd finished them. I can still see his face when I took them in. He went through them with a fine tooth comb and said, "I didn't expect them back today. If you work like this, you'll never be without a job." He then gave me 30 more to bring home. I was paid a shilling, that's 5p each, just to make up a whole jacket. And I could easily do about 36 a week. I used to have to provide my own needles, scissors, pins and cotton, which was 6pence for a spool of 1,000 yards. Incidentally, all the girls in the factories had to provide their own pins and needles and things. They buy them from the factory, they would take it out of money. She says, listen to this, look, I got so used to doing them that eventually I could make a coat every 20 minutes and was earning about £6 a week, which was quite good money, as the craftsmen at the shipyard were only getting £3.10 a week. Now, Agnes was the exception, but you can see by this subdivision of work, started off by Hayam all those years ago, where you could become expert at just doing one particular process. I'm just going to finish with, virtually done now. I thought you might like to see the inside of 1 or 2 factories. This is Crowther Brothers in the 1930s. Mainly women, look, as you can see, as far as you can see. The machines they used were either Singers or Jones machines. That's probably the forewoman standing here. These might be the cutters, or one of them might be the foreman. I'm not sure. The Colchester Manufacturing Company, this is the one that used to be on the site in Stanwell Street where the record office used to be, circa 1935. And this is Hollington's factory. This used to be opposite St Giles Church, where the Southway is now, basically. But this factory got totally bombed in the Second World War, and they had completely bombed out, as did Leaning's, another large factory nearby. But on this particular picture from the 1920s. Can you see all the open top charabancs? They've all got numbers on. And once a year, many of the factories would treat all their machinists to a day at the seaside or somewhere. So they're all off the seaside. And the next picture here, we've got more of a close-up of one of these charabancs. You can see where they're going. Look, it looks like it's going to see Southend, isn't it, probably? And this is outside the old Empire Cinema in Colchester, which is no longer there. And there's Leaning's factory, which wasn't too far away from Hollington's. That was also bombed during the Big St Buttles raid in February '44. But two men there, look, the rest of them surrounded by these women. And there may have been a dozen of these charabancs on their way. We started with Hayams. Let's finish with Hayams. So this is Hayams. These are girls at Hayams factory. That's probably the manager there. There they are. Not sure of the date. This is probably the 1930s by the look of it. And again, we finish on the factory. It's worth pointing out, you know the story now, so if you're anywhere near this, you can always point this out. This was where Hayams, the first clothing factory in Colchester. And that's where we're going to call a halt. But I will just, if any of you are, if any are interested and like to find out a bit more, there are two sources you could look at. There's My Colchester at Work, which has a chapter on the rag trade. And in Essex Harvest, it's a collection of essays in memory of Arthur Brown. Andrew Phillips and I wrote a small essay, if you like, about the Colchester Rag Trade in there. So I hope that's been of some interest to you. And thanks for watching that.